Yep.
Okay.
And one more thing, sorry.
Wow.
Few people need to leave early, so we'll go to our usual time, but we understand some people need to leave early, so.
Yeah, and I won't.
And they've
it's
already
because
announced
you're,
it, so-
you're bored out of your mind.
It's not like they're bored or something.
So most people think of this when they think of Peru, but Peru wants you to think of this, and of this, and of this, and of this. So just to go back to these images, this is ceviche, and that's the cancha that's right here with the sweet potato. That's typical plating for ceviche. This is a granadilla. It's in the family of passion fruit. So if you've ever had a passion fruit, it looks very similar, but it's pink or pinkish red. And this is causa, and this is made with yellow potato, which is hard to find in the States. You can find it, but it's not sold in like your main grocery store, but it creates a really creamy texture that you put into a mold, and you layer it with anything. So in this case, it looks to me like they've layered it with tuna, avocado, and egg, and maybe
Sorry,
some
what's the name of this dish?
causa, C-A-U-S-A.
What do they call it in Peru?
Oh, why do they call it causa? That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it.
Okay.
And then this is ají panca and ají amarillo, both kind of foundational spices for the food. So even the ceviche will have a little bit of ají amarillo in it. Almost every dish has a little bit of ají amarillo. So today I wanted to talk about what's commonly known in Peru as the food boom, or el boom gastronómico. And I'll begin by discussing Gaston Acurio and Virgilio Martinez, the two kind of central figures in the clips that I sent. And then I'll switch to my more recent research on women and nation building through food during the 1950s and 60s. And so I'll begin when I was in Peru doing field work in 2007 and 2008 for my dissertation, which was on the making of Machu Picchu into heritage, and I was looking at photography and a host of other things that are totally unrelated to food. But while I was there, food was declared national heritage in 2008. And this was done sort of as a precursor because they wanted to apply for UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. Yeah, go ahead.
What does that mean? It was made.
Right.
Yeah.
So it also perplexed me because I'm like, what does it mean to say that your food is national heritage? And so I remember distinctly having this conversation with a taxi driver, just like, well, what does that mean? They were like, I don't know, we love our food, so it's national heritage, right? It wasn't that it was a dish or a specific sort of treatment or cultural understanding of food. It was just food is Peru. And Peru is food. And so that actually launched, or was part of a long trajectory of trying to promote Peruvian food globally, right? And so they applied for UNESCO status, they didn't get it. And in 2010, Mexico, a particular form of Mexican food was declared World Heritage, and so was, I think, French gastronomy. And the gastronomic meal, was declared. So other people have written a little bit about this Declaration of National Heritage in 2008 as kind of an elite-driven global competitiveness concept, and so trying to promote Peru through its food globally. And so Gaston Acurio is one of the main figures of this movement, I guess, if you want to call it that. And so the TED Talk that I sent was really interesting to see in contrast to how he's normally talked about and the kind of origin story he gives himself. So he's from a well-to-do family in Lima. His dad was a senator at one point, and he was going to La Católica, which is the prestigious university in Lima, to study law. He hated it. This is his story. He hated it and went, but still went to Madrid to work in a law firm there. But it turns out that he actually was never going to work there, and instead he was learning to cook and kind of eating and stuff. And so his dad found out that as his dad was giving him money to live in Spain to work at this law firm, and his son was not going to this law firm, the cat was out of the bag, that he didn't actually want to be a lawyer, he wanted to be a chef. And so he then went to study cooking in France, which is where he met his wife Astrid. And then they move back to Peru, he comes back to Peru, married with Estrid, and they opened Estrid and Gaston. And they opened that, I believe, in 1994. So it's been around a while. It's gone through various phases. And what he doesn't say in the TED Talk, but he's very open about it, at least in a lot of what he's written about in Peru, is that the initial Astrid and Gaston was French haute cuisine. It was really high cooking, and it really failed. People didn't go to it. And so he sort of looked around and started to reinvent the meals at Astrid and Gaston. And one of the things he did was he was hired to do a television show called Aventura Culinaria and Culinary Adventure, and he sort of Anthony Bourdain went around Peru learning from all these Peruvians how they cook their food. And so he gets inspired, makes a cookbook, and transforms Astrid and Gaston. It becomes this fusion of the resources of Peru, some Peruvian techniques, but really filtered through French cooking techniques. And so since then, he's a machine. He's amazing from an entrepreneurial standpoint. And so these are just some of his restaurants I've listed. I don't know if you've been to Lamar. Lamar is a famous cevicheria. I think it folded in New York. It did open in New York for a while, but it's in San Francisco. There was one in Madrid. Papachos is a hamburger joint. Panchita is a kind of Andean steakhouse. Tanta was one of his first successes as a franchise. And Madame Toussaint is something he just opened up, which plays on chifa, which is Chinese Peruvian food. So he says, for me, a lot of what he says is about food nationalism. So I have a couple quotes that I want to read. So here he says, food is the only country in the whole world where Peru is the only country in the whole world where food is the most important thing. You go to Brazil, it's soccer. If you go to Colombia, it's music. But in Peru, the most important source of pride is food. Food's been able to unite us. So he talks about food as the avenue to build kind of national self-esteem, and he uses those words. People obviously have concerns about other things, but food is considered conceived as the way to build self-esteem and to build kind of a global equivalence. And so in the speech he gave to a university in 2006, and it's requoted in Sazón en Acción, he's talking to a bunch of economists, and he says, we have the resource, we have the products, what is missing? The brands, the Peruvian brands of Peruvian culinary products for the world. There is the key. And then he also says this in that same speech. He plays on this idea of Peru as a nation of mixing, mestizaje, and that is what is so unique about Peruvian food and cooking. And he wants to, I've highlighted in red, transform those ideas into products and brands that will conquer the planet. And so this is really a foundational kind of line of thinking for Peru and the way that they're thinking about their food. Not everybody, obviously, but certain people. And the way they look globally towards, or look internationally. And so since 2006, they have, Peru has started Mistura, which is a food festival of Peruvian food. It didn't happen this year. I was hoping to attend. But Mistura was huge. It was extremely successful, and they invited people from all regions of Peru to come to Lima, where they would showcase their techniques and their different cooking. APEGA was started. This organization is the Association for Peruvian Gastronomy. That was started along the same year of the declaring food national heritage. APEGA was in charge of Mistura. And then you have Prom Peru, which you can see their logo here, and it's in kind of a national marketing agency, and they also do statistical analysis of imports and exports. So it's a really, the food boom is an effort to build equality globally. He has this, he says in this one film that when he went to France, he's coming from this fairly well-to-do family, and he goes to France, and he's not well-to-do. Not only that, is he's like Peruvian. He's kind of cast aside, and this really frustrates him. So he goes back and says, we have all these wonderful things, and the world needs to know about it. So this is Astrid and Gaston. Now, it used to be in a smaller outpost in Miraflores, a kind of wealthy residential district near the ocean, and so he built this, or he renovated this about 3 years ago. It's called Casa Moraya, and it was a completely dilapidated building that had not been used in decades, and it sits in front of a park called Parque Olivar, and it and the Parque Olivar used to be part of a huge colonial plantation or colonial estate in Lima. So it was originally 8,000 hectares, and it's so right where the edge of this photo is taken, there's this huge thoroughfare going through it. So he goes and he restores this building beautifully, and so inside you go and have a tasting menu of their food. To the right, this big tower, you can rent that tower and have like a special party, and there's a kitchen associated with it, and I think it's 3 stories, and it opens up like many colonial edifices, has a huge sort of patio in the middle, so it's just a lovely place, right? There's bars and parties and stuff. They have a kind of a herb garden too that's on that side. And this is Barra Chalaca. This came out maybe 3 years ago, to great fanfare, and it's a cevicheria, so it serves mostly seafood. And Chalaca is the name of a person from Callao, and Callao is a port in Peru, the biggest port city. And so what he's doing there is he's kind of elevating the place of Callao, which is really working class. But then he's putting these sort of their cuisine into places that are, high fashion districts. So I think the image on the back is in a mall, and the one on the bottom, the little excerpt right here, is in San Isidro, which is sort of the business district of Lima. And inside he's kind of recapturing his idea of Peru's past, right? So he's creating this interesting narrative of Peru as a food nation, which we can see from his Facebook post that I showed you earlier on. So this is a famous salsero, right? And so in this restaurant in the Barra Chalaca, he has albums and photographs and different newspapers decorating the kind of outpost. And this just opened last year, and when I was in Peru last summer, everybody said, "Oh, you have to go to El Bodegon." And so you can see this is kind of, he's gone kind of nostalgic as well. He has lots of black and white photographs, and the food that he's serving there is very hearty, huge portion, kind of home style cooking. And so one of the things that both this place and then the Barra Chalaca and some of his other restaurants has made me think about whether like the aesthetics of his restaurant and the kind of way he's playing on history. And so one of the questions I want to think about is whether or not photographs taste. So my question is, do photographs taste? Because they're lending something to this experience, some kind of feeling or affect about the food. That this is more recent than some of his other ones. So he's a beloved figure in Peru, and it's difficult to critique some of what he's doing because so many people love him. He opened up a cooking school about 10 years ago for people who didn't have, who couldn't afford to go to France and go to cooking school. And since then, there's been like so many cooking schools have opened up in Lima and across Peru. But it's free to go to his cooking school, and they graduate and often work in his restaurants. And so he also has started this, which is products. And this is Gaston y Otto, and Otto Kunz is a sausage maker, right? Has other products. But the thing I found so interesting about this, so this is sold in just the main supermarket. But one of the things I found so interesting was the packaging and the tagline, like the kitchen awakens or cooking awakens our memory. So he's sort of one figure. And then the other person I shared, or I hope that you could see the kind of cooking show, was Virgilio Martinez. He's younger than Gaston. He did work, he's also from a wealthy family in Peru, in Lima. He also left law school to go to cooking school. He was studying in Scotland, and he became, discontented with that. And he began traveling the world working as a chef. And so he studied at Cordon Bleu, but in Canada and London. And he's also worked in France. He's worked in New York. He's worked at the Four Seasons in Singapore. And then he came back to Peru and worked for Gaston at Astrid and Gaston in Lima, and then in Bogota. So his food is different than Gaston's. It's much more, well, I'll show you pictures in a minute. It's just a different kind of preparation. It doesn't have the same home cooking quality that Gaston's restaurants do. So instead, I think you just pointed out that it's now 4 on the world's best list. It had been 5, so it's moved up. And Central, they also just reopened. They moved locations in Lima, and they offer a tasting menu, a 12 to 16 course tasting menu. It's all created around elevations and ecosystems in Peru. And so one of the things, like if you go to Peru, everybody will say, well, the food in Peru is so amazing because we have the sea, because they have the Humboldt Current coming through, which is a cold water stream, and it's bringing in incredible seafood. Then you have the mountains, so you get a different sort of foodways, right? Potatoes, different foods that grow in the mountains in the Andes. And then you have the Amazon and all of the food that grows there. And so he's playing on all of these ecosystems. And then Meal just opened last year outside of Cusco in the Urubamba Valley, and there he's trying to think about ancestral cuisines, which in my mind they're not really ancestral cuisines necessarily. They might be techniques or foodstuffs, but cuisine I think is not quite the right word. But he's trying to give the diner, as I say, this is from a newspaper, a sense of time and place and people and view and landscape and produce. So the Morai ruins are a circular, I wish I had a picture of this. They're concentric circles that start off low and go high, right? And then you're surrounded by these incredible mountains in the Urubamba Valley. And that is on the way, I'm sure not without, it's not coincidental that it's on the way to Machu Picchu. Right, so you're getting incredible tourist traffic. So when you go to Cusco, you can go to the Urubamba Valley. It's half an hour away. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment on. I think it's really interesting, like who he's really trying to appeal to. Like this is not trying to raise up ancestral cuisines necessarily, even like for Peruvians. Like there are people obviously. There are national tourists, but they're mostly are international tourists.
They're his demographic for sure is mostly international tourists, but the ancestral cuisines is interesting. So he's working with a biologist and an anthropologist, and they're doing this work in various areas. And so I follow him on Instagram, and so he just posted that they're going to now open a restaurant in the Amazon called Momentum. And so he is very different than Gaston in many ways, but they're still promoting food through, in my opinion, but I would love to hear what people have to say about it, through kind of a food nationalism, because the tasting menu, when I went to, this is Central, when we get to some of the food, and this will make more sense. So this is a new, he got booted from his place in Miraflores for kind of funny political reasons, but he opened up a new Central. So Miraflores would maybe be is like I said, a sort of wealthy residential district, and Barranco, where they are now, is a little bit more bohemian, still coastal and still beautiful. And so he opens up this place also in kind of what had been a dilapidated building. And so I'll come back to this. Well, I'll say this now. So one of the things along with this ancestral cuisines is that, and I believe he talks about this in the video, is they have a laboratory. So this is their laboratory in the restaurant, which is very interesting to me in terms of the discourse of discovery and trying to go out and be scientific, and why would you have the laboratory in the restaurant, and sort of the aesthetics of it, and what kind of taste that is imparting as well to the food. This is when you walk into Central, he has a huge it's like a rock table, and he has placed sort of curated different products, Peruvian products for display, and you can touch them and feel them, right? And then these are some of the courses. And so what was interesting about Alice's talk, the chef from Italy, is that she was really about, or at least what she said, was keeping food in sort of a recognizable form. And they're not doing that really at all. It's all about transformation. It's all about taking something and imbuing it with different techniques and flavor profiles, and kind of playing with it. And so you don't really know necessarily what is being served. And there's that, to me, this is really about class distinction. And so this is actually kind of a classic meal. I don't know when you were in Peru if you had this, where you just have a potato and you have some sauce, right? And you just that's what you're eating. And so he has put it on a different. You don't eat. That's a serving dish, right? You're just eating the potatoes. So that's not edible. Here's another flight of potatoes, and the food is amazing. It's incredible, and the experience is this is why I keep getting hung up on how the taste is being influenced by all of the surroundings. That there's really kind of a sensual, affective quality to what's going on. And so this is the piranha heads. This is piranha skin that he's serving. You don't eat the heads, right? But this also reminds me that when Roberto was giving his talk about spectacle and display, like there's a lot of this going on as well. And in the back, you see that little card. And so that's the menu, right? And so that's what they give you. And then you go through and you work your way up from below sea level to the Andes, right? And so you're eating Peru, and so in some ways you're just kind of devouring the nation through this tasting tour. And this is Meal, which I have not been to. I would like to go to it. And so these are probably the two most prominent figures of this food boom. And then there's the Llama Inn in Brooklyn, Peru. So this is not just in the U.S. actually. This is Eric Ramirez's restaurant in New York City. It was voted the best new restaurant in New York, I think in 2016, 2015. And his story is pretty interesting. So his parents are Peruvian, but he was born and raised in New Jersey. And he became a chef, and he worked at 11 Madison Park for a while. I don't know if you know, but 11 Madison Park is also this very high-end elite restaurant in New York City. And then he also worked at some other restaurants. And he became dissatisfied with, I think he told me he was working at like a kind of a Latin American restaurant where they just like threw all kind of Latin American things together, right? And like, here and cook. And he didn't like that, so he quit. And so he goes to Peru, honestly, I think to visit family. And he actually is inspired by the cooking that's going on in Lima. And so he learns, kind of is inspired by Virgilio, by Gaston, and by other people that I'm not mentioning here. And comes back and develops and plays on this cuisine, right? And so even though that's actually not the story told, most people are like, he's Peruvian, and this is his food. These are brochetas. These are beef hearts, super typical street food in Peru, and he's kind of elevating it Here is lomo saltado, which is also we were talking earlier about the menu in Peru. So many people will eat their lunch out at a place that serves a fixed menu. And lomo saltado is invariably one of the dishes, but it does not look anything like this. It's usually stir-fried beef, a kind of cup of rice, and a little bit of French fries. Eric made this. He says this is his most popular dish. He thinks it's because it's great hangover food. And then this is the rooftop of their restaurant in Lima or in Brooklyn. And so he has imported different plants from Peru. So when I visited, he had huacatay, which is kind of like a lemongrass that's used in a lot of cooking, and he was making like huacatay cocktails from it and other things. And so he is an evangelist and a prodigy. And so on his website, he gives homage to Lima, and he talks about it as being this artistic, creative, and culinary hub of Peru. He's sort of like gone and drink the Kool-Aid in some sense, right? And he talks about Virgilio, he talks about other famous chefs and what they're doing. He tells you where you should go in Peru, in Lima particularly, if you're a tourist. So I need to think about this more, but to me it's very much an immigrant celebration of Peru. And when I talked to him, when I interviewed him, he had this sense, he said, well, when I'm in Peru, they don't think of me as Peruvian, but I'm Peruvian, he thinks of himself as Peruvian. But the food that he ate, that his mother cooked for him, was, big lima beans and rice and food that you eat at home. It was not this food, right? And so he's building his own empire. I asked if he could come speak to my class last semester, and he couldn't because he was in the middle of opening this. But so he's opened up Lama-san, which is a Nikkei restaurant, which Nikkei, one of the other restaurants on the top 50 restaurants in the world, is Maido. And that's a Nikkei cuisine, which is a Japanese Peruvian cuisine. And then he just opened Yamita, which is for those who wanted the Peruvian rotisserie chicken. That just opened in the village. And so he has a whole kind of concept that he's working with. He wants to open, recently in Peru, deli sandwiches have become huge. These little stands where you go and get a huge sandwich and a kind of a juice, because the fruit there is amazing, and so you can go and get this incredible juice. And so he wants to open a place called the Deli Lama, and he wants to open a cocktail place too, but he doesn't really like or at least at that time, I haven't talked to him in a while, he didn't like the name he had. Deli Lama was so good, Bar Lama, not so great. So in this next part, I want to switch and just give a little bit about kind of where this is all going, and then I'll turn to sort of the research that I'm working on. So just to give you a sense of Peru generally, 7.5% of their GDP is agriculture. There's still huge, mining is still a really important part of Peru. And so if you go to the Andes or the foothills of the Andes, you have huge gold mines and copper mines, and it's such a stark contrast to Lima and this food boom that it's somehow hard to keep these two things together. And then half is service, and a lot of that is tourism. So this is actually working. I was looking at PROMPERU and their statistics, and so 82% now of vacationers consider Peru a gastronomic destination. I don't think that would have been the case 15 years ago. And then I'll just show these two. So they're really actively trying to get people to come and spend money on food. And so this says, in this slide, it says, each time we're being better positioned, food is becoming better positioned. And so this development is about recognition at an international level, tourism development, innovation, and appreciation of traditional preparation. And so they they know what is selling. Ceviche is the most popular, and they know why people come and what they're looking for. They still would like Lima to become better known as a gastronomic capital. So one of the things that I was thinking about Virgilio and Gaston is this idea of heritage prospecting. And I've written about this for other things in Peru, but it's this idea to me that the past is a resource and can be an avenue for economic development. And there's this active creation of food pasts that rely on this myth of mestizaje, which I'll talk more about in the second part of my talk. And then I'm trying to think about how aesthetics, affect and kind of play and the sensuality of eating is working in these restaurants. And I also think about them particularly as the new capitalist vanguard, which that's from Mary Louise Pratt's work called Imperial Eyes. And so she talks about colonists coming and seeing opportunities in the ruins around them. And so here, Virgilio and Gaston in some ways are seeing that as well. So there is this myth that Peru is a country of all bloods. And everybody will tell you, pardon me? All bloods, like a mixing of all races and all...
melting pot?
Yeah, a melting pot. And they will say to you, well... she who doesn't have Inca has African, right? And there's this very common saying. And so, but one of the things that, besides this myth of mestizaje, which I'm going to talk more about, is striking to me about Gaston and Virgilio is that really women are not part of this conversation at all, except for the history of food in Peru is really, in many ways, a history of women. And so I wanted to spend some time thinking about women and cooking, and so just because when there was this, I've been going to Peru for like 20 years, right? And so all of a sudden to have it be promoted over and over again that it's now a food nation was just striking to me. And the conversation, like, how is it a national heritage? I don't understand that. Seems surprising to me, and that it was a specific kind of cooking. And it was a specific kind of person, and as a wealthy person who could leave and get particular training and come back. All of these things made me, twitch a little. So I started to look for different cookbooks, and this one is circulating. And this one was interesting to me because it was produced by the Electric Association, and in the back... the back of this cookbook is the most interesting part because it says these are some of the people who've adopted the electric kitchen, right? And so there's this incredible social network, right, of people who had the means to get a fancier kitchen.
I couldn't find the publication date for that.
I know. It's not in that book, but it's around the 30s, I think. But then I found this cookbook, which I didn't bring because my copy is really tattered. And so I was really excited by this cookbook. And so this was published in 1947. And this led me to think about, well, is there this thing going on where you have elite white male chefs and then you have female non-white cooks, right? Is there this kind of stratification happening? And so then I went back to this cookbook, and I wanted to know more about Francisca Bailon, about this cookbook, and I could find nothing about her anywhere. And so I WhatsApped my friend who works at the university there. I was like, oh my gosh, Juan Carlos, I cannot find anything. This is really fascinating cookbook. Do you know who she is? And he wrote me back, just, Amy, this is my great aunt. I was like, what? You gotta be kidding me! Yeah. And then it gets even better because I'm like, she's your great aunt? What? And she was like, yeah, and it's not Francisca Bailon. That's a total invention. The real woman behind this cookbook is named Zoila Petroni, who has grandparents are from migrants from Italy, and that's paternal grandparents, and her maternal grandparents were from Spain. And so then I just thought, oh my gosh, I have to continue with this. This is incredible, and I really want to know more about Zoila Petroni, right? And so this cookbook was one of the first mass-produced and successful cookbooks in Peru. It has a traditional kind of the way we do recipes today. That wasn't always the case, but where she lists a description of how to work with ingredients, and these are the actual measurements. 21 editions sold until the 1980s. And so they changed a little bit of the visual, but you kind of get the sense of who Francisca Bailon was supposed to be. And Zoila Petroni was married to Federico Field, and Federico Field was a publisher. And the Field family was also quite well-to-do. They started, they're British, and they started in the late 1800s a cracker company, which is still around. It's now owned by Kraft. But Federico, was a publisher. And so together they wanted to sell this cookbook. And this image of an Afro-Peruvian woman selling food and being the best kind of cook, this isn't her cookbook, this is a different one, but you can kind of see the same kind of image, right? Mm. So the beginning of Francisca Bailon's cookbook starts with this.
You'll have to charge.
Let me see. How do I do that?
Just go up to the little thing in the corner.
Did it go? Okay, good.
There it is. Take it back again.
Sorry? How's it charge?
I have no idea.
Okay, so this is what she says to authenticate. And so I'll say that nobody
It's
knew.
either all full or all empty.
The light on the sun is
Jesus.
red.
No, that's just the recording level.
Yeah.
No, I was just repositioning it because it got moved. Lights.
That's probably good.
Yeah, it's good. It's okay.
So no, the thing that's interesting about this cookbook is nobody knew that Zoila Petroni had made this cookbook. Will you hear me the batute book? But she starts off, no, the big one. She starts off kind of validating her credentials, and the way she, go ahead, Paul, sorry.
No, I just wondered, what does the name
Francisca Bailon?
What is that, not what does it mean, but what kind of ethnic
Yeah, so
name is that?
yeah, so it's meant to be Afro-Peruvian. So Francisca is a kind of, I don't know. So I'll tell. Yeah. So I ended up asking. So I ended up because my friend said, "Oh my gosh, this is my great aunt." I was able to interview her 3 daughters and ask her some of these questions, like why did she not want to be known, and why choose the name Francisca Bailon. And so they said that she maybe didn't want to be. That she was a little bit, didn't seek the limelight. And they also said that they would say that their family was middle class. For middle class women or upper class women to be in the kitchen cooking wasn't necessarily a revered thing to do at that time, the way in which it might be today. I wonder if it's an homage to her youth, because their family had cooks. So yeah, it's a fascinating question of why Francisca Bailon and where that name came from. But the 3 daughters, I mean, they said, well, we never really talked about it. It was just something that was done and nobody really knew. And so here is a picture of Zoila and her 3 daughters. So she's.
Was it a bestseller?
Edition?
I mean, it sold. I don't know, but I don't know how, like, bestseller. I'm not sure, but yes, and people covet their copy. And I go around to every used bookstall and try and find other copies, and they're very hard to find. And it gets better. So here she is. Let me go.
Which one was which?
So Zoila is the one in the blue, and her 3 daughters, and then her husband.
Did you talk about why she chose that
They all look like they're the same age.
Yeah.
So why did she choose that image? So yeah, they thought that. So I think it was if I think it was they wanted to sell a cookbook, and Afro-Peruvian women had the reputation of being the best cooks. So in my mind, this is a moment of changing economy in Peru in the from the 40s to the 50s. And so if you can't afford to have someone come and cook for you, you can at least have the book. And so this is one of the reasons why I think there's this excerpt in the front of the book saying, hey, I've traveled with this, Limeña family and perfected my craft, and these are amazing recipes. It was successful because the recipes worked, as everybody says, and they were good. And so these are some images that her grandson gave me, but just a little quick thing about the Italian migration. And then I want to show a clip because Gaston goes and in his heritage prospecting finds her cookbook and cooks from it. But he doesn't know that Francisca Badlon is Zoila Petroni at that time. But before we get there, the Italian, so during the guano boom in Peru,
So great. Mysteries of,
Italians come. Her family is part of this. Her grandparents had a small kind of bodega and sold foodstuffs. And this is a super brief history of Afro-Peruvians in Peru. So more than 500,000 slaves were brought from Cartagena to Lima. Most of them left to go work in haciendas and mines, but many of them stayed in Lima. As with, I think, slavery here, having a slave was about prestige and power and property. It's still because of this myth of mestizaje and a country of all bloods. It's really hard to say who is Afro-Peruvian and who the naming, categorizing people is quite different compared to the way it's done in the U.S. And I'll say that there's a lot more scholarship on the Inca and indigenous communities versus the presence of African slaves in Peru. I think that's changing, but there's really a bias towards the indigenous communities of Peru. But one of the things that Henry Louis Gates pointed out he has a book called Black in Latin America. He interviews a scholar in Peru, and they talk about esclavitud jornalero, which is kind of like a journeyman, or where people would work outside of the house or outside of the watchful eyes of the master. And so a lot of food was done outside of the home, or different street vending, or small like bricklaying and stuff like that. So I wanted to show these two clips. Is this okay? Can I keep going? Or yeah? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just have a question that maybe you can answer at the end, but like it's confusing to me, but also sounds parallel to the US in that they're proud of their sort of melting pot heritage, but they also seem to be trying to prove their nationality via food, but their nationality is all mixed, but then they're also trying to prove it by developing Peruvian brands for the global stage. So I was wondering if you could like talk about that more, of just like this really complex, like creating a national identity but having to like prove it globally when their national identity is so complicated. I feel like in the US, we're all immigrants in the US, but then we try to prove ourselves nationally, and it's different, and I don't know how to describe
Well, I'll say that I call it a myth of mestizaje because the mixing, in some ways, I think is true, but in many ways it's also aspirational. So if you look at the skin color of Virgilio Martinez and Gaston Acurio, they're very white, and they have people cooking for them who are much more brown, right? And so there's still stratification based on skin color. It may not operate the same way in the US of like a one drop rule, but it's still not not this glorious fusion that Gaston Acurio is promoting. And so I think that's one of the struggles that I have with him and Virgilio, is that there's a way in which so much is made invisible or is sort of taken and made into something for sale for only their benefit. And that might be maybe putting too fine a point on it. But so I'll give you an example. So this idea of food nationalism, like, so here he goes and he finds this book, Francisca Bailon's book, and he touts her as this Afro-Peruvian woman. Look at us, we're this country of all mixing, and goes and cooks her dishes, and then he's kind of riffing on it, like, I'll show you the clip, like, we can then make it for lasagna, and then how about this, or, oh, we could transform it and sell it here in my restaurant as a dip. So it's still geared towards the taste of outsiders in some sense, or is there a certain kind of taste, A, and then B, you know, these things are myths, like Zoila Petroni was a white woman who was using an Afro-Peruvian image to sell a cookbook. I mean, they might have been her recipes, but the food itself is from that, you know, a very complicated relationship. So let me see here.
Can I ask you a question about what she was, the kinds of recipes in her cookbook?
Yeah.
Can you give me the escape?
I mean,
Hold on a second. I have to do what?
Just
Are
get
they
out
what-
the slideshow.
Just minimize it.
was it what she found being cooked in a certain
Yeah. there's-
certain milieu in Peru? Do you see the Italian trace in it?
You do. Yeah, you do. You also see like English tea sandwiches. It's Criollo cooking, so it's they're common dishes. Many of them are common dishes. Some of them have fallen out of favor, you know, as with anything that's 50, 60 years old. So yeah, it's what she's eating when she's playing with it. Is how I would explain that question. Yeah, but there is so Italian cooking. It's not. It's hard to say what is Italian cooking and what is Peruvian cooking because it's all like together, right? I mean, if you go and like this menu that I was talking about, inevitably there'll be like pesto pasta on there. That's like a mainstay on many people's daily dish, right? And so, and some of the foods that Italians grew just became absorbed into dishes, right? So it's not like there's this is Italian, this is you know, it's yeah. It's, so now I don't know which. Hold on a second.
No, you don't need that one.
No, I need it because I need to know what the timestamp is. 3:30.
Can I follow up on Noah's observation about nationalism? I find fascinating the fact that the idea of building a national identity based on food starts from Peru outwards.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, cultural identities based on foods are determined or defined by immigrants communities who need to find a common ground outside of the country of origin, and therefore they identify themselves, and this is typical of, you know, all the ethnic cuisines that are related to immigration or emigration. I wonder if this effort of almost I don't want to say artificial, but this determination to create this Peruvian identity through food is related to a smaller emigration from Peru. I don't know about a lot of Peruvian immigrants,
Yeah.
but certainly it's not as powerful as Italian or
Mexican,
Polish
yeah.
or Chinese and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's where the nationalistic term that you're using
Mm-hmm.
comes out, because it comes from the nation as opposed to from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, cuisines, and so this effort to export Peruvian cuisine becomes an effort because probably there hasn't been that vehicle that immigrants.
Well, I would see,
Provided to other
what I
cultures.
see in what you're saying, I agree with you, and I think all this is a fascinating conversation. What I see is that this is not unlike the turn of the 20th century when writers from Latin America went to Paris and said, oh, we have this in Latin America, let's go back and promote it. And that's the exact same thing that they just did with the food. We know how to write essays in Latin America. We have our own essayists. Jose Marti was the prime example of that. And so to me, it seems like this is a pattern that Latin Americans do. All the Latin American boom in literature took place in Paris. You know, that's where they all went, and they discovered, oh, well, I'm Peruvian, and you're Colombian, and you're Mexican, and you're Chilean, but we all have this Latin American thing. Where are we doing it? We're doing it in Paris, and our books are getting published in Barcelona. And then we're going to go back to our countries, and suddenly we have a Peruvian literature, a Colombian literature, an Argentine literature, Chilean literature, that the world is noticing. And that's the big thing about the marketing. The world is noticing it. So I see this parallel between the literary boom and the food boom as being very, very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would say about the image. So he even says that they leave and they have this, I don't know, they discover, you know, it's like Eric Ramirez, but his is reversed and somehow. But they leave, they go to Paris or Canada or Singapore. And then come back. They're kind of prodigal sons, bringing the food nationalism. But it's the way I think about what you were saying about the immigrants. Like, it's those actors are outward facing. I mean, it's a little bit internal because he wants people to build self-esteem. But to me, it's really about economic development.
Yeah, and you're dealing with actors who have the means and the resources to go and come back. So it's different than
That's right. We're talking about a
immigration.
certain social class.
Right. So and that's reflected in. Well, it's definitely reflected in Virgilio's food, right? Yeah. So class is all over this.
It's fascinating, a lot of things that I think are going to resonate with I'm doing, because this idea of national heritage and world heritage ambitions is interesting. But I have a question, and it was kind of came up when we watched both the videos that were on the thing. Very brief mention of Shining Path, and also this idea of going back to our roots and is indigenous foods and cultures anything that, I mean, by making it sort of, well, everything's mixed together, it seems like that's being wiped off on things, except the one potatoes.
Except
right?
the
I mean,
potato.
that's almost insult, isn't it?
The indigenous are the ingredients, but not.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's less pretend like we're.
We're picking it from the location, but
it's
it's not that this is what people are eating.
I mean, it strikes me as really interesting that they would, and of course, nationalism is maybe, 19th century creation of the idea of what a nation is.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I don't understand Spanish when they were talked about the Shining Path thing.
Yeah.
Did they, on the video, were they saying, what was the nuances? Was like, boy, we're glad that's over? Or was there any kind of a sense of, maybe I don't know, I know that was crushed, right?
Right.
I'm saying it was mainly indigenous people, was it not?
No. So the Shining Path started in Ayacucho and sort of influenced by Mao, and Abigail Guzman was the head thinker of the Shining Path. So it was a mix of people, and so the indigenous people who were just as terrorized as other people, and so they would have rondas and go and round up people who they thought maybe were traitors, and so that's a whole traumatic event that occurred, that in many ways shapes where Gaston is coming from, and because during that time, the 80s, people weren't coming to. It was a really devastating time for them. So, and I can't recall the precise clip that you're referring to. So I don't know in the film. I don't
Well, he
remember.
mentions it briefly in his recent TED Talk.
I think it was just like, yeah, it's,
It was a
thank goodness
passing
we're
thing. Actually,
beyond
I
that,
didn't
yeah.
know what the
Yeah.
nuances were, but the idea of creating this national cuisine out of many nations is quite interesting, and I think it's maybe there's some kind of a competition of what's going to become, what is our nation? Is this the way the Peruvians view their nation? Is this way?
Well, I mean, this is the other thing, like, other people will say, well, Peruvian cooking is really regional, so this is just Lima. This is a real Lima phenomenon, although it's, kind of radiating, but this is one particular type of food. I don't know, Virgilio, I have never talked to him. I would like to interview him, but I don't know, what do you think? For me, there's this sense of like, they're on an expedition to discover Peru, but they're not, it's not brethren, right? It's more like, what can I extract? What kind of resource can I get from people?
Yeah, I'm really curious to know whether, the communities from which these foods are borrowed feel as though there's appropriation going on
Yeah.
on some level,
And there isn't a bringing back, right? Or like a lot of the restaurants I've been to in Lima, like there's this idea of like manipulating like veggies and things from all of these different regions. But then when you go into the Amazon, there's no veggies. There's no access to them. And so like what part of it is your responsibility as these chefs that are trying to create this national identity to bring those food entities into those spaces as well and to be expanding it beyond that space.
Yeah, Gaston, I don't know about Virgilio. Gaston has more social kinds of projects, because what has also happened, as they buy particular items, the price goes up, making it harder, like you said, their
Right.
particular vegetables aren't available. This happened with quinoa.
Right.
So he has some different social programs where he's trying to, I don't know, temper that phenomenon, but I don't know about Virgilio. Yeah. So maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just send the clips. So
Continue though, we all.
Okay.
So should we take a break?
sure.
I mean, just for 5 minutes? What, you're looking at me funny, Pat, is that bad?
No, I think that's just the way I look.
Carry on.
I
just didn't know if people want to get up and-
Yeah, I'll say that the second part, the second part I don't have as much. This is about the project I'm working on.
Your clips?
Okay, you sure? Okay.
Yeah, put your clips on.
Okay, I'll put the clips on.
I need to.
I think written is able to stand up. Yeah.
There we go.
I want to stand up.
Yeah. That's what I want to do. And besides, you might want seconds.
The memory is extremely important.
No, I just.